And we welcome to the stage Sophia. So Sophia was originally scheduled for, she's part of the AI session, but we switched around to today. And Sophia lives in San Francisco and works for Science Corporation as a group leader there, and is going to be telling us about Symmetry and Universality. Well, I can't pronounce it. But okay, today. Take it away, Sophia.
Universality. Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you so much to the organizers for putting together this fantastic conference in this beautiful location. I'm very grateful to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about probably two of my favorite things, symmetry and universality. I'm very fascinated by neural representations, and in particular, whether there are principles that govern the formation of neural representation, and in particular, whether there are principles that sort of transcend model architecture and substrate, principles that apply to different types of learning systems, be they biological or artificial, different model architectures under different conditions. And there are an interesting class of phenomena that suggest that there might be. Some people have called this phenomenon universality, others have called it convergent learning. If anyone in the audience has ever trained a deep convolutional neural network and then looked at the weights that you see in the first layer, you might be familiar with something like this picture. Typically, in many different types of neural network architectures trained on a variety of different image tasks, including classification, but also segmentation, you'll see things like this emerge in the first layer weights. And in particular, there are these class of filters that appear over and over again, which look like these sort of wavelet filters. Others have called them Gabor functions. They're kind of localized Fourier features. It's one of the most reliable findings that you can see in deep learning, and the fact that it occurs across so many different architectures, across so many different contexts is quite striking. It's even more striking that these features are not specific to deep neural networks, but rather they're one of the most classic findings in neuroscience, the findings of Hebel and Wiesel, who discovered that there are neurons in the primary visual cortex that are selective for basically lines of particular orientation and spatial frequency, so lines of particular width and orientation. These are sort of classically called the edge detectors of Hebel and Wiesel, and they form a canonical finding that the primary visual cortex appears to be in large part organized around orientation selectivity, around picking out these different kinds of features. When you model the response properties of these neurons in the primary visual cortex, they're very naturally modeled with a Gabor function, so that's the localized Fourier feature. So if you do, reverse correlation on a neuron like this in the primary visual cortex, you take a weighted average of all of the things that that neuron responds to, weighted by the strength of that neuron's response, then you can visualize essentially the receptive field of these neurons, and they indeed look like these localized Gabor features. More modern techniques, for example, those coming from the lab of Andreas Tolius, building digital twins of the visual cortex, where you basically train a model to learn the map between stimulus to neural response, and then you can treat that trained model as a sort of model organism and use backpropagation to go all the way back to the input and basically do feature visualization for neurons within this network. So you can optimize inputs to maximize the activity of neurons, which are modeled after the visual cortex. Indeed, you get, again, these striking Gabor-like filters. And what's very interesting is if you continue this approach, basically modern techniques to understanding what neurons are learning in deep neural networks. This is feature visualization. This is basically taking a neuron within a deep convolutional neural network, backpropagating all the way back to the input, maximizing the activity of that neuron. The neurons in later layers, so beyond the first layer, pick out strikingly regular features, such as these curve detectors, classes of neurons that are together kind of computing an equivariate set of curves. And you can see this phenomenon occurring across many different architectures. So the first row is showing AlexNet, the second row is showing the Inception V1 model, the third row is showing VGG19, the last one is ResNet V250. So, these classes of features seem to have a striking regularity. And intriguingly, when you do the same kind of directly parallel calculation to do feature visualization for these digital twin models from Katrin Frank and Andreas Tolias, et cetera, if you look in deeper, deeper structures within the visual cortex, like area V4, you again get features that look strikingly similar to those that we're seeing in these deep convolutional neural networks. And so I'm very fascinated by the question of why that is. Is there some kind of universality of these features? Is there some kind of canonical set of features that subserve the process of image recognition? And I'd like to focus on the Gabor phenomenon, because actually there's something that's very striking about that from a mathematical perspective, and something that we can therefore get a handle on from a theoretical perspective and actually uncover what I would suggest might be a principle of representation formation that transcends model architecture and substrate. Many people are familiar also with the idea that an early explanation, a theoretical explanation for the emergence of these features came from the work of my PhD advisor, Bruno Olshausen, who found also that these types of features emerge in a sparse coding network. So this is a network that's not doing image recognition, image classification, not doing segmentation, but is only trying to reconstruct the input using as sparse of a set of coefficients as possible. And again, we see these features emerge. The explanation from that work was that essentially these types of Gabor functions are capturing the statistics of the natural data. So there's something about the statistical structure of the data that essentially allows it to be compactly represented with this type of Gabor basis. And while that is a satisfying explanation for this set of phenomena, I'd like to suggest that there's a more general explanation that we can offer that generalizes this phenomena beyond just the Gabor case to a broader class of what I would say are the symmetries of vision. And that rests on the mathematics that underlies these features. So, as I mentioned before, these types of oriented edge detectors of different spatial frequencies are naturally modeled with Gabor functions. That is a two-dimensional Fourier feature that has been localized. And essentially the way that we generate that is we take one of these features, we multiply it by a Gaussian window, and we get this localized oriented Fourier feature. Now, many people are familiar with the Fourier transform, typically probably more as an engineering tool. So many encounter the Fourier transform as a method of doing frequency decomposition. So essentially it enables you to transform a signal, let's say a 1D signal like sound, and figure out what the different coefficients of different frequencies are in that signal. But the Fourier transform actually has a very interesting mathematical origin in the mathematics of group representation theory. So it has a sort of dual status. It's not just about frequency decomposition, but actually it's about the mathematics of symmetry. And I'll provide a little bit of a background here to give an intuition for what exactly that means. So what is a symmetry? A symmetry is a set of transformations that leave the structure of an object invariant. So if you think about a shape like a hexagon, the set of these 6 rotations are the transformations that you could perform to that object that would leave its shape invariant. So we can say that this hexagon is described by this set of 6 rotations, which is its group of transformations. I think it's Frank Wilczek, the physicist, who sort of coined the term that symmetries are change without change. So you've done something to a signal, to an object, but that something, that transformation, is kind of invisible to you because the object is left invariant. So symmetry and invariance are critically 2 sides of the same coin. They are sort of dual to each other. And as I mentioned, these symmetries are describable mathematically with the math of group theory. So in particular, this set of 6 rotations that you can apply to a hexagon is define the group D6, which is essentially, as I mentioned, this set of 6 rotations. Now, what is a group? A group is basically an algebraic description of a set of symmetry transformations. And in order for it to be a group, be defined as a group, it needs to meet a few axioms. So in particular, the group needs to be closed under the group operations. So essentially, it's a set of transformations that you can compose, and every set of compositions of those transformations is another element of the group, right? So I can rotate by 30 degrees, and I can rotate by 90 degrees, and I can combine those two rotations together to get another rotation. In particular, there also needs to be an inverse transformation for every element of the group. So every rotation has another rotation that undoes it. There needs to be an identity element, which is essentially the do-nothing transformation, the rotate by 0. And the group also needs to be associative, which means that if I did, A times B times C, that's the same as doing A times B times C. These are sort of technical details about algebraically what would allow you to define a group. But what's important to know is that many of the types of transformations that structure not only our visual world, but the world generally, are describable as groups. So these include things like continuous three-dimensional rotations, translations, scaling, stretching, shearing, squishing, diffeomorphisms. These are all mathematically describable as a group. And that allows us to kind of get a handle on that and build in these structures into representation systems. And I would suggest that potentially the brain is also making use of this mathematics and exploiting this mathematics in order to construct useful representations of the symmetries of the natural world. Now, when we want to do, so as I described it, a group is a quite abstract object. But if you want to do some kind of computation with it, it's useful to convert that group into a group representation. And a group representation is essentially a way of mapping an abstract group structure into something that we know how to compute with, like matrices. So we're basically mapping every single element of the group to a, let's say in this case, a rotation matrix, such that we can preserve the group composition using the math of linear algebra, so just matrix multiplication. So a representation is really an assignment of group elements to matrices that preserves the group structure. And there are many ways of representing groups, many representations of different dimensions, but there's a certain class of representations, which you can think of as sort of the sort of canonical or minimal set of group representations, and those are the irreducible representations. You can see, in our previous example, we're representing each one of these rotations here by a rotation matrix, two-dimensional rotation matrix, but you could just as naturally represent them in terms of the complex scalars, e to the I theta. And in particular for this group that we're looking at, this is one set of irreducible representations for that group. Now, what's interesting here, what you might have noticed by this point, is that these numbers, these complex scalars, are intimately related to that Fourier transform that we all know and love. In particular, what we can think of the Fourier transform as doing is essentially taking a projection of a signal, f of x, onto a set of irreducible representations of the group S1, which is the ring. So baked into the Fourier transform are the irreducible representations of the cyclic group S1. And that's why the Fourier transform has interesting properties with respect to cyclic translations. So really intimately at the heart of the Fourier transform is this notion of translation with wraparound. And importantly, the notion of a Fourier transform can be generalized beyond that particular group. So more generally, we can talk about Fourier analysis on general groups. We can replace those complex scalars with the representations of sort of an arbitrary compact group, the irreducible representations of an arbitrary compact group, which here are represented by rho of G. So rho is your map that assigns basically complex scalars or matrices to elements of your group. And one thing that's very nice about a transform like this, like the Fourier transform, is that by projecting onto the irreps of that group, as I mentioned, it actually gives you this property of equivariance to the group. So for example, if I were to translate my signal, f of x, and then take its Fourier transform, that's equivalent to taking its Fourier transform and then applying a sort of equivalent transformation, which would be a sort of rotation in the complex phase space. And when you put a signal when you convert it into a format like this, it actually makes explicit the transformation in a nice way that can make it easy to remove that transformation. So for example, it makes invariance simpler because if you think about a translated image, when you translate the image, many of the pixels have changed. If you looked at the Euclidean distance between the original and the transformed version, they would be quite different. But when you're in now this new space projected onto the basis of irreducible representations, that transformation amounts only to a phase change. And so if you wanted to be invariant to it, you could simply remove the phase, for instance, taking the power spectrum, or do something a little bit more sophisticated. So essentially, this type of equivariant transformation puts our transformations into a format that makes them easier to basically represent and also separate for the problem of invariance. And invariance is quite important to many different types of perceptual tasks, machine learning tasks. So I'd like to argue that it's really kind of at the heart of many of the tasks that organisms are trying to accomplish in perceptual domains. And critically, what I'd like to claim is that these types of symmetries that define the symmetries of perception, the invariances that define the symmetries of perception, give rise to these types of universal features in learning systems. As I mentioned, we have this sort of Gabor phenomenon, but it's not just that. I mean, if you look at the response properties of, for instance, grid cells in the entorhinal complex, these are neurons which are basically helping the organism to build a map of space, and they have this very striking periodic structure. They are sort of suspiciously also Fourier-like. So there are theoretical analyses that model these kind of as the harmonics of the twisted torus, harmonics being those periodic resonant frequencies of the toroidal manifold. And moreover, these features have been shown to emerge not just in the brain, but also in artificial neural networks that are trained on path integration tasks. So, and if you think about the structure of that task, these are two-dimensional tasks where we're keeping track of position in a 2D space. The torus is exactly basically a compactified representation of 2D space. We take that 2D sheet, we fold it back onto itself, and it seems like no accident that the harmonics of that space, of the geometry that the organism is trying to represent, are exactly what the brain converges to and exactly what deep neural networks converge to. It's not just also in that case, but there's an interesting suite of findings that come from folks in the deep learning world that are interested in the phenomenon of grokking, and they've trained transformer networks to learn to do modular arithmetic. And fascinatingly, similarly, we see the same types of Fourier features emerge in that case. And that makes sense because this is a task with a cyclic structure. So if you think about exactly what the optimal solution to that would be to use a basis of sine waves. And that seems to reliably emerge over and over again in networks that are trained to accomplish this task. There's a sort of suite of findings that converge on this and identify it as a critically interesting model for this phenomenon of universality. Then also in my own work, and really the thing that motivated this line of theoretical work that I'm presenting, we also trained models to learn to be invariant to different types of group actions. And what we found strikingly was that exactly those irreducible representations emerged over and over again in the weights reliably. And it's not just accidentally, and it's not just kind of emerging, it's exactly the irreducible representations, and it's every time, to the point that we're actually able to use this method in order to explicitly recover the group structure. So we could go from the weights of our model to reconstruct the groups, what's called the Kavli table, which is essentially the multiplication table of how different group elements combined. And this phenomenon was so striking and so regular that we were able to use it to basically do group learning. So given a data set that has some unknown group structure, we can recover and tell you exactly what that group is. So we were very interested in the regularity of this phenomenon, and that led to this paper, which is forthcoming in the Conference on Learning Theory, which was really spearheaded by Giovanni Marchetti, also in collaboration with Christopher Hiller, who's in the audience here, and Donica Kragik. Giovanni is PhD advisor at KTH. And in this work, we were able to actually derive theoretical guarantees that prove that any learning system, with an asterisk, so under particular conditions, that learns to be invariant to some kind of, basically signal structure. So if your network star learns an invariant map, then we can prove that its weights are guaranteed to be a Fourier transform. This is a very interesting type of result within neural network theory, because typically if you think about neural network theory, a lot of the results are around sort of convergence bounds, saying we were sort of guaranteed to get close to a solution, but not necessarily what the solution would be. This is a very striking type of theoretical finding where you can show your model is going to learn exactly this solution, and that solution exactly falls out of the symmetry of the structure of the problem. So there's a sort of claim that we'd like to make here that we're sort of able to establish in this particular case, but we hope might sort of give a clue to ways to generalize, that downstream invariance gives rise to the emergence of these types of Fourier features in learning systems. And moreover, we're able to show that if your network learns an almost invariant map, we can also, as I mentioned, recover the group exactly from the weights, meaning that that group structure is really baked into the structure of the learning system once it has converged. It basically has kind of adopted the group structure within its own within its own representational system. So another claim is that invariance is really a powerful proxy objective for symmetry discovery. So if you're interested in this group learning problem from more of a machine learning AI perspective, then the downstream invariance, which is commonly used in many different types of tasks in the context of contrastive learning, that actually provides the constraints that you need in order to recover symmetries directly into the weights of your model. And so we demonstrate this in a suite of different types of models. The first was directly for that original paper, the spectral networks that I introduced in that 2023 ICLR paper. And again, we showed that exactly we're guaranteed to converge, so we're able to find a theoretical explanation for that finding. But we also show it for more general types of models, such as a Mokolo-Pitts network, and then more general deep neural networks. And indeed, we're able to explain this phenomenon that when you train a model on rotation to learn to be invariant to the group SO2, you get these beautiful, basically recover the disk harmonics of different frequencies and do so reliably. And this is sort of our demonstration showing that indeed you can recover exactly the group Cayley tables from the weights of these models, and that is basically a guarantee. So your recovery success is basically 100%. And then when you add noise, you can eventually phase shift and get to 0% once you get to a significant enough standard deviation of noise. So anyway, in summary, what I'd like to offer is that indeed there are some universal principles of neural representation, and some of those principles are grounded in the symmetries of the data that the brain is trying to resolve, to make use of, and that we can look to the math of symmetry to understand principles of representation formation across both biology and artificial systems. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia. So I guess technically an AI talk, but lots of beautiful connections to neuroscience, so perfectly placed today. I think we have time for one question here, and then any more questions maybe take into the coffee break and ask Sophia there. Okay.
Hey, hello? Yeah, really interesting talk. What is the star, that asterisk on networks that...
Yeah, that's critical. So essentially, we make a couple of assumptions. So in particular, for the math to work out, we assume that the weights are complex valued, and that your weight matrix is almost orthonormal. And our results also, for some reasons, only apply to the first layer of the model. So we have the expectation that those Fourier features will occur in the first layer weights, but we're not able to say anything about the later layers of the model.
Okay.
I think we can do this question as well. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, like, a lot of problems in computer vision, in general, could have. So you could have an image, in general.
Could you bring the microphone a little bit closer?
Sorry. Yeah. You could have an image, a real image, and you could also have like a sketch, probably representing the same object.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think models like this could capture this universality?
And the type of... Sorry, go ahead.
Simply because you have the same object. So like, for example, for a cat or for an object like dog, or so for a simple classification problem, will universality be able to capture these features, which would be probably invariant, symmetric, things which you pointed out, but even if the modalities are quite different. Modalities being sketch, image, different cameras or so.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it goes even beyond what you're offering. So there's the phenomenon of being able to recognize a cat in an image, but also when it's sort of hand-drawn, just capturing the essential forms. But then also, what like clip embeddings have shown us is that it's very powerful to use this invariance objective even across modalities, right? So if you try to put text and images into the same space where you're preserving relationships in those different spaces but across the modalities, then those are very powerful representations. And the theoretical findings that we present here don't generalize exactly to those cases, but we think that something like this is underlying that phenomenon, because exactly where by using these kinds of invariance objectives, we are getting at the underlying symmetries that govern all of these different modalities. So there's sort of some structure that is shared across them, and the invariances reveal what that structure is.
Right, so the last one would be, so I have to model these invariances when I'm actually putting in both the modality or so, when I'm training these models, let's say?
So no, what our findings show is that the invariance objective, which is kind of agnostic to what those transformations are, you just say I want to be invariant to whatever is making this class of things different, but we say it's still the same class. Just using that as your objective is enough to get the system to actually learn what the structure is. So you don't need to build it in by hand. Rather, it's discovered through the proxy of invariance.
Okay. Let's take any further questions into the coffee break. Let's thank Sophia once again.